Hi, I'm Dennis Young with Issues in Education. I'm here with Tony Wagner. Nice to have you.
Pleasure to be here, Dennis.
Yeah, we're at the annual conference in 2019 of EDspaces here in Milwaukee, and it's a fabulous program. You're going to be keynote speaker here in about 30 minutes or so, and a great turnout. I'd like to, as I've watched some of your YouTube, you've been introduced a whole number of different ways. and I know the importance you placed on the power of the question. So I'm going to ask you a question.
Okay.
What's the best way you would introduce yourself?
A recovering high school English teacher who's still trying to figure it out.
Well, that might relate to everybody then. Because everybody's trying to figure it out.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I thought rather than having you just talk on all the same issues you always talk on, because when it comes to knowledge, you're like knowledge, ubiquitous. Everybody knows what your message is. But when you really listen to what you're trying to say, there are some areas that I think make a real difference and people can really capitalize on them. And that is when you take a look at our educational system, the fact that it is a silo, it's an organization that's not designed for change.
No.
It's not designed for emphasizing failure.
Right.
So how do you steer this big ship in a whole different direction when everybody is fearful on how to do that?
Yeah. That's a question I get asked a lot.
Oh, really?
And I think that, in fact, I mean, at least more recently, people are saying, how do you help teachers overcome their fears,
right.
Their cautiousness?
Right.
And to me, the first job of leaders is to help folks understand the problem. Mm-hmm. We are transitioning very rapidly from a knowledge economy to the innovation era.
Right.
And it's going to demand completely different things of our kids, skills, dispositions. Teachers have no idea.
Right.
And so our first job is to engage them in the problem and not offer them a solution. Mm-hmm. The tendency of leaders in education is to offer a solution to a problem educators don't know they have, and an answer to a question educators haven't had a chance to explore.
Right.
So that's point one.
Right. Then
point two is, when I talk to educators, I say, look, you have to do a risk-benefit analysis. Mm-hmm. Are there risks in moving forward? Yeah. Mm-hmm. What are the risks of not moving forward to our kids, to our economy, and to our country? You have to look at both. And then finally, I say, I want to get the F word out of school. Mm-hmm. It's crippling. Mm-hmm. In the innovation world, you talk about trial and error. You talk about iteration.
Right.
You don't use the term failure in the pejorative sense that we use it in education.
Right.
So I'll say, look, if you have a team that's done its research and is taking a responsible risk, there is no such thing as failure. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be better than what preceded it, and you will learn through trial and error in the way that most of us learn many things.
Mm-hmm. Well, since the roles in education is now switched, the students have a much greater responsibility in the learning process. Teachers are fearful of technology.
Yeah.
Most of those students know more than the teacher knows.
Yeah. So again, we so often say, well, the role of the teacher in this new era is to be a facilitator. Yeah. I'm sorry, who wants to be a facilitator? Yeah. That's such a weak term.
Yeah.
My view is that the role of the teacher moving forward is to be a performance coach and a mentor. Okay. A performance coach coaching students to higher standards of performance in the way they do in the athletic field or in the arts. That's the job of every teacher today, to mentor and to coach.
Well, it's interesting, as teachers are looking to help kids grow and fail, parents aren't looking for Johnny to come home with a B in science. Right. Because University of Michigan will not be on his list to get into college. Yeah. How do you deal with the parents and the teachers that are fearful of the parents and that whole process?
It's an enormous challenge. Parents are far more fearful today than they were 25 years ago. They see a much more competitive universe. Right. They want to give their kids a competitive advantage, and they think the only way to do it is to push their kids harder and harder and harder. One result, a 50% increase in teen suicides in the last decade. And half the kids at Harvard are seeing counselors and taking medications for mental issues. Half.
Wow.
So to me, again, the problem is re-educating the parents. The competitive advantage today is for a young person to be able to take initiative, communicate effectively, organize him or herself, have grit, perseverance, responsibility. These are all things that matter far more than a GPA. A GPA doesn't necessarily reflect anything except your ability to please your teacher and jump through hoops.
Right.
So we need to switch from a high standard of grades versus a high standard of performance. So I advocate much more of the kind of merit badge approach to learning.
How does that approach differ in different parts of the country, different cultures, inner city, rural?
It's a great
North,
question.
south, how does that apply?
Well, you know, years ago, I was involved with a project where we would go in and do focus groups with local communities about what were the outcomes that mattered most to them. Now, some were common everywhere. Critical thinking, collaboration, communication, creative problem solving, citizenship. But then in different areas, there would be unique responses. Here in Milwaukee, a decade ago, the other thing that I heard from family was, we need kids to learn how to solve disputes without violence.
Right.
Conflict resolution.
Right.
In the rural areas of Wisconsin, I heard something very different. I heard families say, we need young people to learn entrepreneurial skills so they can create jobs here in this community and not move away. So we have to attend to those local nuances. They're very important.
Well, I'm going to jump to the bigger picture of this social divide. Those students that develop the skills necessary to be creative innovators, and those that don't, and all of a sudden artificial intelligence is going to take those jobs away from them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's one of the things I'm going to be talking about today.
Are you? How do you address that? How do you solve that problem? Because the direction that we're headed is, well, our system's different than Finland, different
For sure.
IB.
Yeah. Well, again, it comes back to my favorite Einstein quote: the formulation of the problem is often more essential than the solution.
Right.
The problem is not to get more kids to pass more dumb tests.
Right.
The problem is not turning up the flames on an antiquated punitive accountability system, which is how we've defined the problem for 20 years. What gets tested is what gets taught. If you have a bad test, you're going to continue to have bad outcomes. And the business community is just beginning to wake up to this fact. After 25 years of education reform, nothing is better. So I think the challenge is for business leaders, educators, community members, and legislators to come together and say, what should a high school diploma mean? Right now, today, it's a certificate of seat time served, not a certificate of mastery. So let's change the language here. Let's reimagine education for the 21st century.
So how do students find their passion, being able to be on learning topics or areas that are really relevant to them? Because as we talked beforehand, different areas of the country, what's relevant to one is different than someone else. But once they find what's relevant, their level of passion just explodes.
Takes off. Yeah.
Just takes off.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Well, you know, I'm asked the question often, well, how do I find my passion? You know, I'm 17, I don't have a passion yet. We have to understand the origins of passion. It starts with curiosity. And one of the things we systematically destroy in school is curiosity. Longer kids are in school, the less curious they become, the fewer questions they ask. So if you start with saying, how do we affirm each child's curiosity? I advocate, for example, every child keep a question journal. A question where they write down a question or a concern of interest to them, periodically meet with a teacher, where they're asked to circle the question or concern that kind of continues to strike them as really interesting. So you start going from curiosity to interest. And in the free exploration of interests over time, eventually most kids discover something about which they're truly passionate. Then the final problem is to support that passion no matter what it is, whether a kid wants to become a professional clown or a musician. This is where parents have to let go and kind of, you know, keep your fingers crossed. But in fact, most of these passions are going to morph into a deeper sense of purpose, which kids will find ways of expressing in often more conventional kinds of jobs if they can't succeed as a clown or a musician.
Well, as I look at the kids as they come up through the grades, at the elementary level, they're all very bright-eyed, very excited, and play is just a natural part of their learning process. Then as I get to the more middle grades, the whole trying to be cool takes an effect, and they start to kind of dull down in their exploration. When they get to high school, you have
it's all over.
Yeah, it's a big divide. Yeah. And if you're trying to get collaboration in the classroom, how can I collaborate with you if you're not a collaborator?
Right.
How do you do that?
Well, again, we haven't valued collaboration. We've said that's cheating in school, you know? So if you label collaboration as cheating, well, of course I'm not going to collaborate with you. So I think, again, you create the structures, team-based structures, where teams of kids are accountable to one another for a common outcome, a problem they have to solve, a question they have to answer, and they know they're going to evaluate one another's contributions to this team, so there's none of this one kid does all the work of the group stuff.
Right.
So to me, and I've seen schools that do this all over, and the difference is night and day.
Yeah, you bring the least capable student along in the group, and then before you know it, they're leading the group like everybody else.
Or you discover along the way that a kid whom you thought was less capable has a different kind of contribution to make, often a unique contribution.
Interesting. I am working with a superintendent right now, a Dr. Tony Lake. You already had the word Tony, so. And he's superintendent of Lindbergh Schools, and we're designing a new high school. And they have the 4 critical C's: critical thinking, collaboration, communication, and I think I didn't say
creativity is what they usually say.
Right.
Yeah.
Are there anything else that you would expand on those 4 C's, or could you comment on them?
First of all, so often we talk about these as essential workplace skills, but in fact, for the first time, I think in human history, the skills you need for work in the 21st century are exactly the same skills you need for active and informed citizenship, for lifelong learning, and for active and creative leisure. Because more and more kids in the future are going to have more leisure, either because it's a gig economy, they're between jobs, or they're living longer, some combination. So in fact, those skills and dispositions, I think, are essential for all 4 outcomes. And it behooves us as business leaders, as educators, to talk about all 4 outcomes as equally important.
A couple last questions. As we're designing schools, and the taxpayers are funding these schools, so there's this balance between being frugal and functional and something that they're used to seeing in terms of classrooms and so on. It's just, it amazes me that trying to push the envelope and have the community who pays for it support it, have the teachers who have to use the space understand it, that we don't, as design communities, start creating these spaces that, you know, they're going to go back and put up some walls.
Of course they are.
And change it around. Or the next school principal that comes in says, what idiot designed this space? I don't know how you solve that.
Well, very often what's missing in the design conversation, in my experience, is the student voice.
Okay.
And so I would start with doing focus groups with recent graduates. In what ways were you most well prepared? In what ways were you least well prepared? What would be your advice to educators? What would be your advice to parents? Videotape the focus groups and bring them back. And you could add to that kind of repertoire of questions the question we're discussing now, which is what kind of education space would have better enabled you to thrive as a learner? And so and I would also use current student voices. And again, videotape those voices, bring them back to the community, show them to the school board, show them to the educators, and say, okay, as we design, we can't just design for the past. We have to design for kids and their future. What do we learn from these voices?
Interesting, because I do know a major university designed a innovation center. And when you walk down the halls, and the administrators are so proud of everything, and there's certain rooms that are just packed with kids, and there's others, there's no kids in them. And what was learned was that a student will make up their mind in the first 20 to 30 seconds whether that's a space that's conducive for how they want to use it, as opposed to how they're told that they have to. They'll go to where they want to be, and they're all in there.
They vote with their feet.
Yeah, so what you just said is right on. Ask ask them.
Yeah.
If you had to do a kind of a final shout out to everybody who's listening to this, what would be a couple key recommendations you could give to affect change?
Well, I think communities have to come together to really answer the essential question. What does it mean to be an educated adult in the 21st century? What should a high school diploma stand for? And then what kinds of assessments will inform us? A lot of schools now are doing a profile of a graduate, which I think is a great start.
Right.
I highly commend that.
Right.
But if you don't attach assessments to those outcomes, they're just like noble pieces of bullet points on a blackboard. They mean nothing. And so that, in turn, I hope and believe, should result in our becoming much more aware of the accountability tests and assessments that we're currently using and all of the ways in which they are destructive to education. We got accountability 1.0 in the 90s because of business leaders. Basically rebelling against lousy outcomes.
Right.
And that accountability has been done to educators, not with educators. So I believe we need to be, all of us, advocating for accountability 2.0 and something we develop collaboratively, keeping in mind that what counts cannot always be counted.
Right.
We have to be less data-driven and more evidence-based.
Excellent. Very good. This is Tony Wagner, and I appreciate talking to you.
Oh, it was
Very
fun,
nice.
Dennis. You asked great questions.
Very great. Thank you.